great victory and its results. Степан Малинцов, Leningrad,
Добрый вечер, дорогие товарищи.
Good evening, dear comrades.
Сегодня очередное
Today is
занятие
another lesson
университета
of the
рабочих
University of
корреспондентов.
Workers'
Тема
Correspondents.
занятия
The topic of the
«Историческое
lesson
значение
is historical
победы
significance
советского
of the
народа в
victory of
Великой
the Soviet
Отечественной
people
войне
in the Great
и
Patriotic War
современная
and the
интерпретация
modern
ее итогов».
interpretation of its results.
Читает лекцию
The
первый
lecture is
секретарь
given
ЦК
by the
КПСС
first secretary of the
Степан
Central
Сергеевич
Control
Малинцев.
and Auditing Commission of the Communist Party.
Приближается важная дата в истории нашей страны.
Malинtsov,
80
an
лет
important
победы
date in the
Красной армии
history of
советского
our
народа
country
в
is
Великой
approaching 80
Отечественной войне.
years
Это
to
событие
the
действительно
victory
эпохальное,
in the Great
поскольку
Patriotic
оно
War. This is truly
предопределило
epochal
дальнейший ход истории,
event
и более
because it
того, оно
predetermined further course of history
оказывает
and
свое влияние по
moreover it has
сегодняшний день.
influence
Поэтому,
to this
наверное, не
day in
случайно
current events. Therefore, it's probably no
открываются как бы новые
coincidence that new
страницы,
pages are
развязываются
being
дискуссии,
opened, discussions
ставятся
are being
под
unleashed,
сомнение те или
and
иные
certain
договоренности,
agreements
итоги.
and results
Ну, это, опять же,
are being called
попытка,
into
да,
questions,
опереться
into question.
на
Well, this is
это
again an
великое
attempt
событие
to rely on
для того, чтобы
this great
оправдать
event to
проводимую
justify
политику в
the policy
настоящее
being
время.
pursued at the present
Мы
time.
знаем, что Вторую мировую
We
войну
know that
развязала
World
фашистская
War II
Германия
was
при
started by Nazi Germany
попустительстве
with
стран
the
западной демократии.
connivance of Western democratic
В
countries.
1936 году
In
Гитлер
1936,
заключил
Hitler signed the
антикоминтерновский пакт со
anti-commando
странами оси и, так сказать, американцы, англичане и
with the
прочие
Axis powers.
думали, что Гитлер пойдет с
And
войной
so
на
the Americans, the
Поэтому они
British,
спокойно
thought that Hitler
наблюдали,
would go
как
to war
развивается
with the
фашизм. Но
USSR,
они
so they
просчитались.
calmly watched as fascism developed, but they miscalculated.
Гитлер
Hitler
вначале
first
захватил
captured half
пол-Европы,
of
уже только
Europe
потом двинулся
and only then
на
moved
Советский
on
Союз.
to this on the Soviet
Мы
Union.
знаем,
moved on the
что
Soviet
войны,
Union.
ну так,
We know
бывают
that
разные, да,
wars, well, there are
национально-освободительные
different kinds
некоторые
of wars,
называются,
some
захватнические.
national ones, some liberal
Бывают
Russian
войны
ones, some are called
гражданские.
aggressive wars.
Бывают
There are civil wars,
империалистические.
there are
А здесь вот
imperialist
назвали
wars, and
отечественные
here
войны. Почему?
they called it the
Вот когда
patriotic
можно
war.
войну
Why?
назвать отечественной?
When a war,
Где
when can a
вот
war
этот
be called
критерий, да,
patriotic
какая
war?
война, как
Where's
можно
this
она
criterion?
отнести к
What
отечественной или
war
нет?
that is? How can
Но
it be
считается, что
classified
отечественная
as a
война – это когда
patriotic
весь
war or
народ
not?
встает на защиту
Well, we believe that
своей
it's
страны,
when
на
the
которую
entire
напали.
nation rises to
И это
defend its
проявляется
country,
и в массовом
which has been
героизме
attacked,
на
which is
фронте в
manifested
тылу
in mass
и
heroism
в наличии
on the front
партизанского
and in the
движения.
rear, and
Вот это
in
главные
the
как бы,
presence of
критерии.
partisan movement. This
Первая
partisan
Отечественная
movement.
война в истории
That's
нашей
the
страны,
criteria.
она
The first
произошла
patriotic
в
war in the history of our
1812
country
году,
took place in
когда
1812.
объединенная Франция,
Then a
которая
united
тоже
France,
покорила
which had also
пол-Европы, да, двинулась на
conquered
Москву,
half of
на
Europe,
Российскую
moved
империю.
towards Moscow,
Я привел
the
цифры
Russian
вот в этой
Empire.
таблице, вы можете посмотреть.
I have given you the
Кто,
figures in this
так
table. You
сказать,
can see
подзабыл.
who
812 год, численность
If you
Российской
have
империи
forgotten,
была 40 миллионов человек тогда, а
1812,
Франция
the
со
amount
своими
of population
сателлитами
was 40 million
захвачена.
people then,
Численность
and
была
France with
70
its
миллионов.
satellites
При этом
had 70 million people,
армия ее
and at the
была
same time its army
значительно
was
превосходила
significantly
российскую,
superior to the
600
Russian,
тысяч. Но она наполовину была французская,
600,000,
наполовину была из,
but it
так
was half
сказать,
French,
из
half
поляков, немцев,
was
ну и
made of
других.
Poles, Germans, and
Мы знаем
others.
итоги, да, что
We know the results
полгода буквально
that
прошло, она была разгромлена.
literally
В том
in half a
числе и
year it
потому,
was defeated,
что
including
население,
also
крестьяне
because the
России,
population, the
они
peasants of
стали
Russia, they
выступили
began
против, так
to
сказать,
oppose
захватчиков,
the
организуя
invaders,
партизанские
organizing
отряды.
partisan
При этом, если в
detachments.
начале
Moreover, if at
стихийно
first this
процесс
process
начинался,
began
но крестьяне побаивались,
spontaneously,
как отнесутся
the peasants
царские власти к
first
этому,
were afraid
то
how
потом, когда
czarist authorities
дали
would react
зеленый
to
свет
this.
и сами
But then when they
царские
gave
генералы
the
начали
peasants the green
организовывать, то
light and
тогда
the
вот
czarist
это
generals
приняло еще
themselves
более
began to
широкий
organize
характер и более массовый.
partisan movement, this took
Потери
even broader
в данном случае убитых
turn. In this
то
case,
есть
the number
французской армии
of
было
people
350
killed in the
тысяч, 100
French army
тысяч.
was
Это условные цифры.
350,000.
Понятно, что это не до человека, это вот так историки оценивают. 350 тысяч погибло,
About
100 тысяч было
350
взято в плен,
died,
причем
100,000
брали вот
were
эти как
taken
раз
prisoner. Moreover,
партизанские
these
отряды
were precisely the
крестьян.
partisan detachments
Потому что
of peasants.
французская армия мародерничала, они заставляли их потом восстанавливать.
The French army was looting,
Тот ущерб,
so they
да,
forced them to
который они
repair the
нанесли.
damage
Ну и
afterwards
порядка
that they had
100 тысяч
caused.
дезертировало,
About
поскольку воевать за
100,000
Великую
deserted
Францию,
because fighting
когда
for
она
Great
победоносно
France,
идет,
when
это
it
одно, а когда она
goes
начинает
victorious
терпеть
is one
поражение,
thing,
все
but when
другое,
it
вот
starts
эти
to suffer defeat,
войска
it's quite
из других
another.
стран, они разбегались.
These
И в
troops
Париж
taken
вернулось
from the
только
other
50 тысяч
countries,
из
they ran
этой
away.
армии.
And only 50,000 of
Поэтому
this
вот
army
это
returned to Paris.
само событие
Therefore,
оставило
the
очень
event
глубокий
itself
след.
left a very deep mark
И тоже
and
оказало
also
определенное
had a
влияние на ход
certain
истории. То
influence
есть
on the course of
престиж
history.
России на
That is,
международном
Russia's
уровне вырос,
prestige at the international level has grown.
но в то же
But
время
at the same time, the
крестьяне,
peasants
которые были основной
who were the main
силой, народной силой,
force, the people's force,
не получили
did
ничего
not
по итогу
receive
войны.
anything as a result of the war.
Если в странах Западной Европы на
They
тот момент
weren't
уже было
given
отменено
anything.
крепостное
If
право,
the
то
serfdom was abolished in the West
по
at that
результатам
time,
войны крестьяне надеялись, что и
so
здесь пойдут
peasants,
какие-то
Russian peasants
уступки,
also hoped
гражданские
that there
права.
would be some
Однако
concessions
этого
and
не было
civil rights
сделано
given to
ничего.
them
И не
in
случайно это
Russia too.
предопределило
However, nothing was done
Первая
about this.
Отечественная война, восстание декабристов,
So
цель которых, это хоть и
the
сверху была
Decembrist
попытка, но
uprising
тем не
was
менее были
predetermined
прогрессивные у
by
них
that.
мысли,
Their goal
это
was
освободить
they had
крестьянство, отменить
progressive
крепостное право,
thoughts,
вести
their
гражданские
goal was
права
to
и свободы и
liberate
прочее. То есть и тогда
peasantry,
уже Первая
give civil
Отечественная
rights and
война,
freedom, etc.
она
Even then, the First Patriotic War
повлияла на ход мировой истории.
influenced the course of the world history.
Сейчас мало кто помнит, вот укоренилось,
Now
да,
few people remember
термин
the
Первая
term
мировая война.
First World War.
А когда она началась, ее так не называли мировой.
But when it began, it was not
Царская
called
пропаганда ее называла Второй
a World
Отечественной.
War. Tsarist propaganda
Была
called it the
попытка,
Second Patriotic
вот
War.
этот, как Владимир Ильич
There was an attempt
говорит,
to unleash this, so to
шовинистический
speak,
угар,
as
такой,
Vladimir Vladimirovich says,
развязать в
chauvinistic
обществе,
frenzy
мобилизовать
in
как можно
society,
больше.
to mobilize as many
Но
as possible.
Отечественная она не стала и
But
по
it did not
сути.
become domestic.
То есть здесь Владимир
And
Ильич
in
правильно
essence,
дал анализ. Это была
our president
империалистическая
gave
война, если
correct
только со
analysis.
стороны
It was an
Сербии и был
imperialist
справедливый
war.
характер, то
Only
остальные
Serbia had a fair
преследовали
character, the rest
передел
were
мира,
pursuing a
вообще
redivision
говоря.
of the world, generally
И было
speaking.
два блока,
And there
которые
were two
воевала.
blocks that
Это
fought.
Антанта и
This is the
Тройственный союз.
Entente and
Здесь я тоже привел цифры.
the non-triple alliance. Here I also
Численность,
provided
например,
figures.
Российской империи
For
на тот
example,
момент
at that
население
time
было
the
уже 170
population of
миллионов,
the Russian
и
Empire was already
мобилизовано было 15
170
миллионов
million,
человек.
and 15
То
million
есть
people were
достаточно
mobilized.
большие силы.
That is quite large
Причем
forces,
погибло 2,5, пленных 3, и мирное население
Two
погибло 1 миллион человек.
and half people died, 3
Всего
were
по
captured, and a
блоку
million
Антанты
civilians.
участвовало
In
население
total, the
1
population of the
миллиард
Entente bloc was
315 миллионов. То есть это уже действительно
1
мировая
billion
война. Да?
315 million. This
Мобилизовано
is
было
a
45
real
миллионов,
world war,
погибло
right? 45 million were
пленных
mobilized,
5,
7 died,
а мирного населения
5
8
million were
миллионов.
captured, and
Погибло в Первую мировую
8
войну
million
со стороны
civilians
Антанты.
died in
В
the
основном
First
это
World War on
население
the side
Индии,
of
то
the
есть колонии.
Entente. Basically, this is
Основная
the
масса.
population of India. That
Германия
is the
была
bulk of the
67
colony.
миллионов.
Germany had
Мобилизовано было
67 million,
13
13
это
were
уже
mobilized.
основная страна Тройственного союза. Погибло
This was
2
the main
пленных,
country
полмиллиона.
of the Triple
Мирное
Union.
население
2
67
million
тысяч.
prisoners died.
Не как в России.
Half a million died. Civilian population
Всего, значит, по вот этому
67,000. Not like in Russia, but in total,
союзу
in this union, the
численность
number
158 миллионов, мобилизовано
was
было 25, то есть он
158
значительно
million,
уступал по
25
своим
were
ресурсам.
mobilized. That is significantly
Антанте
inferior
погибло
in terms of
4,5,
its
пленных
resources.
3,5,
The
и
Entente
мирного тоже
lost
3,5.
4, captured 3
За Первую мировую войну
million were captured.
население стран составляло 1,5 миллиарда, которые принимали участие в боевых действиях. Мобилизовано было 71 миллион человек,
Those who took part in the
погибло 10 миллионов, пленено было 8,5, и мирного
10
населения
million
погибло
died,
11,5
8.5
миллиона.
million were
Если взять со
11.5
Второй
million
мировой войны,
civilians died. But if we
которая
take the Second World War,
с 1939 по 1945 год,
which lasted from
то
1939
население
to
сопоставимо.
1945, then the population is
Население
comparable.
составляло стран,
The
которые
population
участвовали в боевых
consisted
действиях,
of countries that
1 миллиард
participated in
900
the
миллионов.
military actions.
Мобилизовано
1
было
billion,
значительно уже
900
больше.
million,
127
significantly more
миллионов
were
погибло
mobilized.
на фронтах, 24
127
миллиона.
million mobilized, 24 million
Пленных
prisoners died on the
28
fronts,
миллионов, мирное
28
население
million
47. То
civilians.
есть ущерб
died.
сам по себе по сравнению
That is,
с
the damage
Первой
itself
мировой
increased
вырос,
compared
то есть значительно.
to the First World War.
При этом я
And it grew
вот,
significantly.
хочу
At
указать,
the same time, I would
отдельно
like to
выделить
point out
Советский
that
Союз.
the Soviet,
Численность имел на тот момент
Soviet Union
197
separately.
миллионов.
the number, the
Мобилизовано было
population at that
34,5
time was
миллиона человек.
197 million.
Погибло
34.5
8 на
million were
фронтах.
mobilized,
Пленных
8
5
million
миллионов
died at the
дают
front,
такую цифру.
5 million
И мирного
prisoners,
населения 18 миллионов. То есть она была направлена против
and 18
отечественного. Почему?
million
Да?
civilians.
Против
This
мирного
was
населения,
directed
естественно, это вызывало ответную реакцию.
against civilians. Naturally,
Германия,
this provoked a
основной,
response. Germany
которая
was the
вначале
main
покорила Европу, и она
country
использовала,
that
конечно,
initially
все
conquered
ресурсы
Europe,
всех,
and it used, of course,
всех
all the
этих стран.
resources of all these
Численность 70
countries.
миллионов,
there were
населения
70
было.
million people in the
Мобилизовано
population.
было 18, погибло. Вот здесь
18 were
американцы дают 5
mobilized and
миллионов,
died.
наши исследователи
Here the Americans
7,5.
give the number
Почему
5
такая
million, our
разница?
research
Потому
is 7.
что в документах
This difference exists because in the
войск,
documents of German troops,
повара,
cooks,
инженерные войска и прочее, они не
troops,
числились
they were
военными,
not
они
listed as
числились
military, they were listed
гражданскими,
as civilians.
хотя они
Although they
участвовали. Потом как взять вот
participated
эти
in the war.
коллаборационисты, которые были? Они, кстати, были и в
There
Первой
were also
Отечественной войне
collaborators
небольшой слой.
who were
Польской
also
шляхты,
in the First
они перешли
Patriotic
на
War,
сторону
a small
французов.
layer of the Polish gentry, they
Но это
went over
всегда
to
как
the
бы
side
есть,
of the
но
French.
основная масса,
In this
конечно,
case,
народа, она берет
the
оружие
bulk of
и
the people,
против
of course,
захватчиков
takes up
борется.
arms and fights
Ну и
against
то же
the
самое по
invaders.
мирному
Well, the same
населению.
thing
Разница
applies to
1,3,
the
в
civilian
зависимости,
population. The
как
difference is 1
отнести
to
кого
3,
к мирному
depending on how
населению
you
или к войскам
classify them as
военных.
civilians or as
Я для
locked
примера
troops.
здесь Соединенные
I
Штаты
use the
Америки.
United
Вот
States as
если
an
посмотреть
example
по
here.
итогам,
If
то
you look at the
Соединенные Штаты
results, the
Америки
United
страна
States of
победитель
America
и чуть ли
is
как
the
в
winning
экономическом плане,
side in
по-моему,
economics
главный
terms, in my opinion,
выгодоприобретатель.
the main
Вот как
was
она
the main
участвовала.
beneficiary. That is
Население
how
было
it
131 миллион.
participated. Its population was
Армия мобилизована
131
было
million.
16
The
миллионов,
army
достаточно много.
mobilized was 16
Но
million. Quite a
погибло
lot died.
вклад, да, у нас на
What was the
фронтах
contribution?
Советского Союза 8 миллионов,
got
400 тысяч. Причем большая часть это в войне с Японией.
400,000 died on the fronts of the Soviet
Вот. В
Union.
плен было взято
Mostly
130 тысяч, и
in war
мирных
in
жителей
Japan,
погибло 90 тысяч.
130,000
То
were
есть
taken prisoner and
несоизмеримо
12,000
совсем,
civilians
совершенно
died for
несоизмеримые
America. That
цифры.
is not even comparable,
Но
completely
здесь
incomparable
надо еще
numbers.
сказать,
But here I must also
что за мысль у меня пропала, что я хотел сказать. Поэтому двинемся дальше. По
let's
итогам
move
Второй
on.
мировой
As a
войны
result of the Second World War,
страны-победители они определили
victorious countries
мироустройство, да, в котором мы сейчас живем на
the world
международном уровне.
order in which we live
То
now
есть вот
at the
основной
international
итог
level. That is the main
войны как
result
раз
of the war
состоял
was
в том, что была
precisely
создана
that the
Организация
United
Объединенных
Nations,
Наций,
the
Совет
Security
Безопасности
Council,
и
and
так
the
называемое
so-called
международное право,
international
к
laws
которому все
were
время все
created, to
апеллируют,
which
кто его
everyone appeals all
признает,
the
не
time.
признает
Some
и прочие
recognize it,
международные
some not.
институты.
And
Совет
by
Безопасности
international
это
institutions.
надстройка над
The
ООН,
Security
но по
Council
сути
is a
дела вот она
superstructure
и
over the
является
UN,
руководящим
but
органом
in essence it's the
и
governing body,
определяет
and it determines well
политику, да, которая
the
проходит
policy
в мире на
that takes
международном уровне.
place in the world
Вообще
on the
ООН
international
может
level.
быть любая
In general,
страна, которая
any country
признает
that recognizes
директивы,
the
которые они там
directives that
принимают,
they adopt,
мирное существование с другими странами,
peaceful coexistence
границы
with other
признают
countries,
и
recognizes
обещает
borders and
все свои
promises to
разногласия
resolve all
разрешать
their
мирным
differences
дипломатическим
peacefully
путем.
through
Хотя этого
diplomatic
никто не
means.
делает,
Although
как
no
мы
one
видим, да,
does
то
this,
есть здесь всегда действует право
as you can see,
сильного.
right?
Кто сильный, тот и
So
начинает
this is
диктовать
the
свою
law
волю.
of
Но
the
тем не менее, вот
strong. The
это все
strong one
декларируется.
dictates his will, but nevertheless, all this is declared officially. The Security Council consists of 5 members and 10 temporary members, and are selected for a specific period on a geographical basis. The permanent members have the right of veto. 5 countries, 5 countries who won the war: the United States, Soviet Union, now it's Russia, France, which also, and England and China. Of course, quite a few years have passed, and the balance of power is not longer the same as it was in 1945. Many countries are already dissatisfied with the state of affairs. The Security Council, all the time there are proposals to change things, to bring them into line with the existing state of affairs. For example, India. It also claims to be a permanent member. Therefore, attempts are being made to propose increasing the number of permanent members and temporary members, and also expand the rights for temporary members. However, those countries that are currently there, they of course do not want to share power, so they block all attempts. All this, there's such a hidden struggle going on there. But all members of the Security Council are united in this, that the current structure must be preserved, and that's why such structure still exists. In terms of financing, we looked at the budget of the Security Council headquarters in the United States, every country that is a member of the UN must pay membership fees. This is how the UN budget is formed. 22% of it includes about 190 countries. That is quite a lot in the UN, members of the UN. 22% of the budget is financed by the United States of America and 12% by China, Russian Federation, 2.5%. That's the contribution, right? The United States finances this organization. Apparently they believe that as the main donor, it should be subordinated to them, this organization, to their interests. Now I'm telling you about the results that the Russian authorities do not keep silent about and are talking about it, because there are things that they are trying to somehow hide, to divert attention from. This is the first result, the creation of an international system. What we emphasize is that the Soviet army liberated the countries of Europe from the fascist plague, thanks to the Soviet troops, and at the same time about 1 million of our soldiers perished. This is the result. They couldn't free themselves. The Soviet army liberated them. The colonial system collapsed, we know that too. Here it is in its previous form. It's not that it has completely collapsed, and there are no more dependent countries. Of course, this is not true, but in its previous form, this colonial system was destroyed. The existing colonial system was destroyed. Let me remind you that before 1939, 69% of the population, which occupied 77% of the globe, were colonies. It was a colonial world, so this system had collapsed. Well, they try not to advertise it, yes. Modern Russian propaganda. But first, the patriotic war needed unity, but also a material base, the spirit, but also weapons. Just the spirit is not enough, and in fact economies are always at war too. The economy of united capitalism, represented by these European countries, was competing with the Soviet economy. So if modern propaganda can talk about planning, that it is capable to ensure planning, state monopoly capitalism can plan production within certain limits, of course, but the main thing is that they don't tell public property, where there is no private interest, can do the best planning. Whether there is no desire to profit from a military order or to profit to get rich at the expense of the needs of the suffering people. In a socialist economy, there is no such thing. And plus, concentration, which is unthinkable even for capitalism, since there is some state capital, but it still doesn't have the ability to subjugate all private capital. There's no such possibility, unlike in Soviet economy, and where all the capital is concentrated in the hands of the Soviet government. So this is, of course, a more efficient economic model, Soviet model. This is what modern propaganda, Russian propaganda, doesn't speak about. And as a result of the Second World War, we know that the camp of socialist countries was formed, and at the same time education itself was a threat to capitalism, because at that time it was difficult to say how the socialist revolutions would proceed. Maybe the socialist world will disappear altogether because the capitalist world was so enormous. It exerted a lot of pressure onto the socialist camp, and the capitalists were forced to make many concessions to the workers in their countries to prevent revolutionary changes. And the situation was that capital made concessions, and even without a fight, struggle, began to create more or less acceptable conditions of work and the rest to the workers. So there would be no organized struggle to prevent organized struggle of the workers. Well, the Western democracies have shown their predatory scowl, shown their first. During the war, they did not enter the war for a long time. We know that, yes. With the second opening of the second front, they kept lagging, making promises and waiting who would to strike at the right moment, could support the losing side a little, so that the bloodshed would continue longer, so that their enemies would weaken each other, their competitors would weaken each other. That is, they were interested in the defeat of the Soviet Union as a whole, but they were, of course, also afraid of Germany, since it could attack them too. That's what they were balancing on. For example, the Americans provided assistance to
были оказались преподнести стороны американцев, например, помощь Ленд-Лиз, которую они одно время пытались преподнести, что вот это именно
at one time they tried to present the Lend-Lease as it was assistance that helped to defeat everyone else in the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War. That Lend-Lease was the help that helped the Soviet Union to defeat everyone. But if we look at the figures, first of all, do you know when the Soviet Union, Russian Federation nowadays stopped paying the Lend-Lease? Do you know which year they stopped? In 2006. In 2006, it was a paid assistance. Kind of yarmulke that we have put on for several decades. This is one thing. Secondly, if it was beneficial for them to give, it was beneficial to give them Lend-Lease help to us. Secondly, the share of Lend-Lease from all military production during the war years amounted to only 4%. It's clear that this is a certain contribution, 4%, but it is impossible to say that it had any significant impact. That is simply a quantity of smaller order. So here, of course, the Americans, those who sing along with them, they lie. And we know that at the end of the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, countries were hatching plans for preemptive strikes against the Soviet Union. Now, this is where Churchill comes in. It manifested itself in the fact that they created the NATO bloc. Against whom? Against the Soviet Union, naturally. That is, not only did Western democracies collaborate with the Germans, they saved all these Nazis, the people who were interested in, from the point of the view of professional experience, to use in the future. These Nazis, professional Nazis, were saved. They also created the aggressive NATO bloc. And this also all happened directly following the Second World War. The capitalist world saw a threat in the Soviet Union, in the socialist camp against itself, and it was ready to suppress, attack, and so on, defend itself by armed means. Well, there is also such a revision of the results from the left. There is the Greek Communist Party, and it believes that the tactics of the anti-fascist fronts that the Comintern carried out, their tactics were during the war. For example, in Greece, an alliance of communists and social democrats, a union was formed, and they formed partisan units of resistance. In many countries, the left united with the Republicans. In France, for example, the same thing happened in order to fight the fascists, but this tactic did not justify itself and was wrong. Was it a mistake or not? We believe that, on the contrary, it has demonstrated its effectiveness by not allowing some openly fascist forces to come to power. For example, in some Latin American countries, the alliance with Social Democrats weakening the states of the Nazi axis. There would be more of them. There will have been more resources. Plus, it allowed to organize resistance to the fascists. It is clear that the allies are unreliable, these Social Democrats, but we should not afraid of these alliances, as Vladimir Ilyich Lenin put it, temporary alliances with unreliable people. We shouldn't be afraid. Only people who are unsure of themselves do this. That's why communists are confident in themselves and are not afraid of this. So, well, to distort the events of the Great Patriotic War, from the very beginning, all this happened, we know. Goebbels' propaganda tells this, told all sorts of fables in order to raise the fighting spirit of their own people and demoralize our people. That's understandable. But after the end of the World War II and the Great Patriotic War, this propaganda continued, and it went on throughout all time. It will probably continue just as long as classes and states still exist, the Goebbels propaganda. It also happened in the Soviet Union as well. Khrushchev was the first to falsify these events. Not only did he slander Stalin and a number of Soviet military leaders, but he also began to pursue a policy of rehabilitating these banderites who are now running the show in Ukraine. Why did he do this? Well, apparently he needed to question Stalin's authority in order to pursue a slightly different policy within the country. The exact opposite policy he needed. If under Stalin prices were reduced every year on April the 1st, then under Khrushchev prices began to rise, tariffs began to fall, which led, for example, in 1961 to protests in the city of Novocherkassk. In 1962 was the protest in Novocherkassk against the policy of Khrushchev's policy. Plus, at the international level, naturally, there have also been changes. For example, a number of countries, socialist countries, or those on their path to socialism, they did not welcome such a turn of events on the part of Khrushchev. From Khrushchev. This is the same for China. They did not welcome that. There were good relations with China. There were good allies, and the relations deteriorated with China after these actions by Khrushchev. It's clear that Gorbachev caused enormous harm. There was a general stream of slander pouring out both about the cause of the war and, so to speak, about the role of Stalin's party and about the role of Stalin's party in the results of the victory, of how he organized the victory in the Second World War, in the Great Patriotic War. Naturally, this continued under Yeltsin. The victory itself is an inspiring factor that mobilizes the country. And if a country needs to be subjugated, turned into a raw materials appendage, a colony, then it is clear what gets in the way. This knowledge that the country is a winner in the war, pride in this, involvement in this, because many had relatives who were still alive at the time who told that, and all this had to be destroyed. And from there, all sorts of, outright Goebbels propaganda began. Goebbels propaganda, if we remember, yes, the beginning of the 90s, in the beginning 1990s in Russia, in relation to the Great Patriotic War, all this Goebbels propaganda pulled out about the penal battalions. We have had won thanks to the penal battalions, defeated by thanks to Beria detachment that shot everyone who retreated. This kind of lie. Well, if we compare again, here's a figure, for example, the number of mobilized in the Soviet Union, 34 million, and the number of penal battalions. Has anyone thought about it? What it was during the entire war? Well, even according to the estimates of American historians, who tend to inflate their figures in their favor, they give 400,000. How could a 400,000 strong penal battalion defeat the German army when the French army consisted of several million capitulated in a month later, some months later? So of course all this is lies who were told not by chance, on purpose. So the task was, their task was that the goal at the time of American propaganda was to, while the Soviet Union collapsed, was to try to somehow weaken the Russian Federation so that it would split up, apparently, into weak states in order to exploit their natural resources, human resources. To do this, it was necessary, of course, to undermine morale. So this is not a coincidence. And Putin did the same thing, by the way, in 2004. On the eve of the 60th anniversary of the victory, the Russian Federation produced a resolution to the UN Assembly, General Assembly, that victory day, the 9th of May, should be called a day of remembrance and reconciliation. This resolution was adopted. So that was the Russian Federation that introduced that. Okay, but reconciliation with whom? Victims and rapists? Reconciliation with honest people with bandits? Fascists and communists? How do you even imagine this? But nevertheless, they adopted that. At that moment, according to what Putin himself said, our guarantor of the Constitution, and in Constitution was... our Constitution stipulated that international law was prioritized over national law, I remind you. That's an obvious dependent country, Russia. According to Constitution, he cast the line in order to join NATO. So he was like behind all this. Let me remind you that in 2004 the Baltic states were accepted into NATO, and apparently at that moment Putin also wanted to be one of the bourgeoisie under patronage of the NATO of the United States in order to calmly plunder the resources of Russian Federation and be untouchable. But it didn't work out. Therefore, a certain revolution took place in Russia in politics and also in relation to Victory Day. Let me remind you that in 2007 a law on the Victory Banner was accepted and also went in an interesting way. At first, the entire Duma, Russian parliament, refused. Soviet symbol, how? There should be completely different symbols. They wouldn't accept it. But nevertheless, when Putin made them, they immediately voted for it. Why did he insist on voting for this? Because in 2008, remember his address in Munich in 2008, yes. In 2007 it was. About the fact that the unipolar world should be multipolar for progress. the world needs to be changed and so on. How do you change it? For this, you require completely different guidelines, different mood within the country. From here came again the propaganda of the victorious people, certain kind of propaganda, and somewhere it still continues, and they do it brilliantly, the fight of these attacks, the slander and so on, but they don't go all the way. And of course, they don't tell the whole truth about the victory day, about the contribution of the Soviet people, the Russian authorities. They, of course, won't do this. I again draw your attention to the fact that here's the law, about this law on the victory banner. And then there came such a thing, what's called the immortal regiment. It was another patriotic act. When did it start? When people come out with banners and portraits of their relatives. It started in 2007 also, about that time. It just hadn't reached such a scale yet, but the first attempts have already been made. When we went to the demonstration on the 1st of May along the Nevsky Prospect, there were very few people. There were many different types of demonstrators, but there were not many people who watched them. That was very political, but there were very few spectators. But on May 9th, when we went, the whole of Nevsky Street in St. Petersburg was full of people. Lot of them came out. This again shows that the result of the war is that it is still perceived as domestic, patriotic, because of the folk tradition. It is still preserved. And naturally, the authorities tried to take advantage of this somehow. So they gave us allowed us to carry out portraits of our relatives. They weren't allowed to do it before. So the people mostly became spectators, and the people supported this a lot. It happens for the first time in Tyumen in 2007, Tyumen city. And the scope of this grew and spread throughout the country. This was this patriotic march by the people of Russia. And it spread it even to the other countries. Why is Russian Federation... Why has it spread? Why do they spread this officially through Russian embassies too, and so on? This is to reflect the dominance of the Russian Federation, the folk of victory, a victorious nation. Because the Americans are telling a completely different story, that they were the ones who won in the war. And this mood, especially in the former Soviet Union republics, this constant reminder of this is beneficial to Russian capital. This is a more favorable environment so that people would treat Russian capital more loyally, and also for labor migrants, immigrants who they want to bring them up in the spirit of that we're all together, we're all winners. And because of that, they behave more calmly here in Russia. It is profitable. So it spreads beyond the Russian Federation. It is supported by the ruling class, which is trying to dominate, to maintain its position, to strengthen it in the world. It needs it. That's why it is pursuing this policy, the ruling class of Russia. Same thing was used in 2005, where they first used the so-called St. George ribbon. There's a certain replacement here, substitution, a certain trade-off
Символ победы. В 22 году, кстати,
as a symbol of victory.
специальный федеральный
In
закон,
2022, a
который
special federal
закрепляет
law
георгиевские ленты
was
символ вот этой
adopted
победы.
that St. George ribbon is now a symbol of this victory.
В начале,
But
она
at
по
the
цвету
beginning,
очень похожа на георгиевскую.
its color is very it's the very first ribbon, the Soviet ribbon, and this ribbon are very similar in color.
И если вот специально так
Orange and yellow.
не рассказывать, да, то отличие от
The first is orange black, the second is yellow black, and it's
по
difficult
памяти
to
уловить сложно.
remember
вообще,
the
по
difference
памяти, какие
the
цвета
people.
в георгиевской, какие в гвардейской.
which colors are the St. George ribbon, which colors are the ribbon of the gods, the Soviet ribbon.
Вот сделали опять же ассоциацию, что георгиевская лента
So
это
they
Первая
made
мировая
this artificial
война, да, георгиевский крест.
thing to associate the St. George ribbon that was used in the First World
И
War
георгиевский кавалер.
and was attached to St. George crosses
Ну, как бы связать.
to connect this with
В истории
somehow
буржуазии выгодно
to Soviet period. This is beneficial
связать
to
Первую
the Russian
мировую,
bourgeoisie
которую они
to
пытались назвать
link the
Второй
First World
Отечественной,
War, which they tried to call the Second Patriotic War, but it didn't work out,
со второй, с Великой
to link it to the Second World War, with the Great
Отечественной,
Patriotic
связать
War.
такую преемственность.
So this to create this sort of continuity or heritage,
Мирить белых и
to
красных.
reconcile the whites and the
Через
reds,
эту георгиевскую
the
ленту. Такая
communists and
небольшая подмена есть.
anti-communists. Through this St.
Тоже они
George
пытались
ribbon,
ее по всему,
they
по
also
всем
tried
странам.
to introduce it
И
in all
даже
the
по
countries,
максимуму доходило, что
and
в 70 странах там
in
в
70
какие-то
countries
года вот эта георгиевская лента использовалась
this St. George ribbon was used
при мероприятиях,
During the
посвященных Дню Победы.
Victory Day.
Однако сейчас
However,
это считается
today,
после начала специальной военной операции
after this
признаком
SMO
экспансии.
started special military
Во многих
operation,
странах она
this is considered a sign of expansion.
запрещена
In many countries
законодательно
it's banned.
использование георгиевской ленты.
The St.
За нее
George
можно
ribbon.
вообще получить, так сказать, и срок.
And you can even get a prison term for wearing
Или
it.
нападение каких-то националистических сил.
Or you can be
национальных.
attacked by some nationalist forces for it, etc.
Вот сейчас Российская
Today,
Федерация
the Russian
пытается,
Federation is
власти, да,
trying,
официальная
or the
пропаганда,
authorities, official
пытается,
propaganda tries
связать
to
Великую
connect,
Отечественную
is
и
trying to
специальную
connect the
военную
Great
операцию.
Patriotic War and the
Внешние
special
признаки.
military operation.
Тогда против нас воевала
Then, in the Second World War, the United Europe was fighting against us.
против Советского Союза
Against the
воевала
Soviet
Объединенная Европа и сейчас.
And now we have the same
Тогда
thing.
мы воевали с
Then
нацистами
we
и
fought the
фашистами.
Nazis
И
and the
сейчас воюем.
fascists, and now we
Вроде
fight the
как,
fascists.
так сказать,
And
похоже, да, очень?
this is very similar.
Действительно, очень похоже, но
But
полной аналогии здесь быть не может.
There can be no complete analogy here.
Мы поддерживаем вот,
We support,
в данном случае
in this
действия
the actions
российской
of
армии,
the Russian army
специальную военную операцию. Но что не
in
договаривают?
special
Почему
military
нет
operation.
полной аналогии?
But what are they not
Ну,
telling us?
во-первых, Российская Федерация не
First of all,
Советский
the Russian
Союз,
Federation is not
освобождая
the Soviet
какие-то
Union,
территории или
right?
занимая, она не несет
And
туда
by liberating
свободу,
or occupying some territories, it does
строя,
not bring freedom there.
не освобождает людей.
No socialist system doesn't liberate
Так,
people.
были они в состоянии угнетения,
So they stay in the state of
лишенные средств
oppression, deprived of the means of production,
в силу этого вынуждены, да,
and as a
продавать
result
рабочие.
forced
Так
to
все это
sell their
остается.
labor power.
А многие
So all that remains.
на Украине
And many in
воспринимали,
Ukraine
по крайней мере, в
perceived,
начале
at least
2020
at the
году, что
beginning,
идет возврат к
2022,
старому, да?
There was a
Что
return to the
приходит
old,
Россия и
that Russia was
возвращается
coming
вместе с
and
этим и социализм.
returning socialism in a way
Возвращается.
too. But it's
И
not.
получается, что вместо
It turns out that
одних
instead
угнетателей
of
приходят на их место другие.
Those oppressors, others come to take their place.
Но это вызывает определенное разочарование.
This
Если мы
causes
помним,
some
что в
certain
начале
disappointment.
22 года
We remember that at the beginning of
когда
the
активно
22nd
использовалась символика советская,
year,
да, красные
22nd,
знамена,
2022, Soviet symbols were actively
но
used.
стихийно даже
Red banners. This
поднимали,
was done spontaneously.
там жители выносили.
Residents carried out
Бабулька
red
выходила
flag.
с красным.
That famous case when an old lady came out with a red
Сейчас
flag,
этого уже нет,
red
потому
banner.
что
This is no longer the case, because, well, the essence of what's happening is not the same as in Soviet Union. Later, during the Great Patriotic War, the children of military leaders, marshals of Stalin, they fought within the troops, the regular troops, because it was a patriotic war. And now the children of these figures, Russian authorities, where are they? They drive expensive cars at expensive resorts. There are some exceptions, very small ones. As a rule, it is ordinary people who fight. From the hinterlands, who are tied up in loans, go there out of desperation in many cases. So that is not the same thing. What's happening in the troops, not the same thing as in Soviet time. Well, the main thing is that the government never says why the reason of the war between Ukrainian and Russian people. Why does it happen? What is the reason? The reason is capitalism, and they are partly to blame for this. This is something they cannot deny. All they do is blame Vladimir Ilyich Lenin for creating Ukraine. It was Lenin's idea. But they say nothing about capitalism. This is where we must expose this lie and show it, that it's a lie. And I'll briefly tell you how this holiday is celebrated in other countries, because a certain ideology is already used. How did they call the Victory Day in the Soviet Union? Right after the Great Patriotic War ended. The Day of Victory over Fascist Germany. The complete name, the full name is the holiday of celebrating the victory of the Red Army and the Soviet people over Nazi Germany in the Great Patriotic War of 1941-1945. That's the correct name. It's long, of course, but that's how it is. It means, in France, for example, what is the Victory Day called? The situation there is that situation should have been friends with the Federative Republic of Germany, the winner, and they were the losers, and somehow build relationships with them. Many countries in Europe were on Germany's side. They named this they call their Victory Day Freedom and Peace Day.
День свободы и мира, Франция.
That's how France called it, Freedom and Peace Day. Well, that's how they... Because they capitulated. There's no victory, right? It's freedom and peace. Nazi Germany. Well, what do you call it in Germany? Former Nazi Germany. For us, it's a victory. For them, it's a defeat. How do you celebrate that? You can't celebrate defeat. They called it the Day of Liberation from Nazism. Well, that's correct. For them, it is the Day of Liberation from Nazism, because they were truly liberated. This is right. This is proper. Yes. And in Ukraine, which we right now conduct special military operation in, and where Bandera people have come to power, a fascist regime. Of course, Victory Day is officially banned. Firstly, they celebrate May the 9th, Europe Day. Europe Day is the day when European Union was created. It is also a holiday. They celebrate the 8th of May. In Ukraine. They call it the Day of Remembrance and Victory over Nazism in the Second World War of 1939-1945. So they
отказались от Великой Отечественной войны,
abandoned the
перешли на
Great
Вторую
Patriotic War, refused its ideas.
мировую.
They switched to the
Уже у них
Second World War,
39-й,
and they now
45-й,
have
39-й.
39th, 45th years of war.
При этом они говорят о
Why
том,
the
в своей
39th? At the same time, they talk
пропаганде,
about,
что
in their state propaganda, they say that
значит, нацистская
Nazi
оккупация, советская
occupation, the
оккупация,
Soviet
как и страны
occupation,
Прибалтики.
as well as the
То есть они
Baltic
мало
states,
различают и
they make little distinction.
вот эти две как бы силы и говорят, что обе
These two
плохие,
forces
и
say
одна, и
that
вторая. А мы
both
боролись за национальную
wars are
независимость.
bad, the one and the other. And we Ukrainians
боролись
fought for national
своим
independence.
бандеровскими
They
отрядами.
fought in their Bandera
Вот если опять же
units.
сравнить
Now, if we
по цифрам,
compare
сколько
the numbers
численность
again, what was the
бандеровцев
number
было?
of Bandera troops?
Вот
At
на
their peak
пике
there
их
were
было 40 000
40,000 of
человек.
them.
Поэтому они
At the same
очень
time, they were
занимались
very
террором
involved
мирного
in
населения,
terrorizing the
уничтожили
civilian
очень много.
population. They destroyed a lot
А
of people,
численность
killed a
украинцев,
lot of people,
которые
and the number
воевали
of
в составе
Ukrainians who
советской
fought in
армии,
the Soviet army,
и многие
and
герои,
many
там тоже много
heroes.
героев Советского Союза,
There are lots
6
of
миллионов.
heroes of the Soviet
Вот если
Union,
так сравнить, да?
and the overall number of Ukrainians fought in the war was 6 million. If we
По
compare
численности. Коллаборанты, бандеровцы,
the number of
националисты,
Banderites, collaborators,
советская
nationalists,
Украина,
and the Soviet
опять же,
Ukraine,
несоизмеримо. Поэтому
it is
Украина
incomparable.
была
So the population of Ukraine was 6 million people.
единая, да, тогда в составе
So,
Советского
therefore,
Союза, и Советский
Ukraine
Союз,
was united then
единая страна,
as
и
part
воевала
of the
с
Soviet
нацизмом.
Union. So the entire Soviet Union as a single country fought against Nazism, and they were collaborators, traitors to the people, including the Ukrainian people. However,
Официально сейчас
official propaganda
делается
now
совсем
focuses on
другое,
something completely
и
different.
уже сравнивается
And
последний
it
раз.
is already being compared.
Зеленский
The
выступал
last time
и
Zelensky spoke
говорил
and
о
talked about
расизме, да, о том, что тогда они
Russism.
боролись, значит, тогда украинцы боролись,
the fact
победили
that
нацизм,
Ukrainians fought and defeated
бандеровцы
Nazism.
победили нацизм. А сейчас они
The
борются
Banderites
с
defeated
расизмом
Nazism.
на
And now they're
специальной
fighting Russianism, the so-called Russianism, in this
для
special
них
military
они
operation.
войну
That's what
называют. Тем
Zelensky
не менее, они
says.
тоже используют
They call it war, but nevertheless they also
Вторую
use
мировую войну, но
the results
преподносят,
of the
искажают
Second
ее
World
до
War, but
неузнаваемости.
distorted
Прямо
beyond
противоположно, то, что
recognition
делается на
in a way
Украине.
that is directly
То же
opposite to
самое
what is
делается и в
being done in
Прибалтике.
Ukraine. The
Во-первых,
same
они
thing is
8
being
мая
done
все
in
празднуют,
Baltics.
называют
First of
свой
all, they
день.
all celebrate May 8th. They commemorate the
День
day of the
поражения
defeat of
нацизма
Nazism
и
and the
памяти
memory
жертв
of
Второй
the
мировой
victims
войны.
of World War
День
II,
поражения
day of the
нацизма и
defeat
памяти
of
жертв
Nazism
Второй
and
мировой войны.
remembrance of the
Это
victims
8
of
мая.
World War
9 мая у
II.
них День Европы.
It's on May 8th,
Наших,
and the 9th of May is Europe Day.
ну, южных республиках, да?
In our southern
Грузия, например,
republics,
День победы
Georgia,
над
for
фашизмом.
example,
Ну, нормальное название,
it is the
единственное, там
day of victory
запрещено,
over fascism. Well, it's a normal name. The
Георгиевские
only thing is
ленты
that
и прочее.
St. George ribbons and other
Считают,
things
что
are prohibited
Российская
there.
Федерация агрессивное
They believe that
государство,
Russian
хочет
Federation is
они
an
в НАТО.
aggressive state and they're
Которое
asking
тоже
to join
победило
NATO, which also defeated fascism.
Америка там и Англия и Франция.
Looks like.
В Узбекистане
Well, America, England, and France defeated fascism. That's what the Georgia's official position is. In Uzbekistan,
День
this day
памяти
is
и
called the
почести.
Day of Remembrance and
Туркмения. День памяти
in
национальных
Turkmenia,
героев
the Day of
Туркестана,
Remembrance of the national heroes
участвующих
of
во Второй
Turkestan,
мировой войне
who participated in the Second World War of
1941-1945
1941-45.
Мировая война была
The
с
First World
39-го,
War
да?
was
Тут у них неправильно. Почему-то они
started in 39, right? They have it wrong
сейчас,
here.
да, только
But for some reason
национальных
they
героев.
participate and celebrate only
9
national
мая, как
heroes.
День Победы, отмечается
May
в Азербайджане,
9th as Victory
в
Day is
Беларуси,
celebrated in
Казахстане, в Киргизии,
Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan,
Молдове,
and
ну,
Moldova.
тоже с оговорками.
Here
На
too,
законодательном уровне
all
есть,
this
а
exists at the
формально,
legislative level with certain
сказать,
limitations, but formally,
не
so
очень-то
to
в
speak,
Молдавии
it's not
существует.
very noticeable in
Поэтому даже вот
Moldova
в
now.
названиях
Doesn't stand
вот
out
этих
this
праздников, да,
holiday.
праздничных
So
дней
these, even the names you can
смотреть,
see,
они еще
these
меняют их
holidays,
названия.
they
Например, в
still keep
Армении День
changing their
Победы и
names.
мира.
For example, in Armenia it's
Тоже
called
какое-то такое
the Day of
название.
Victory and Peace,
День
also some kind
освобождения
of
Шуши
weird name. And
в 1992 году отмечается одновременно. То есть они
there's the Shusha Liberation Day, another
приплетают еще
holiday
какие-то сюда праздники,
celebrated at the
поэтому
same
тем самым
time. So they
размывая
drag
величие
in some other holidays,
над фашизмом.
thereby blurring the greatness of the victory over
Ну и
fascism.
в заключение,
Well, in
выводы,
conclusion,
которые надо сделать, наверное,
that need to be made.
Еще, наверное, я хотел сказать, на Украине.
I also wanted to
Там
add that in
спонтанно
Ukraine,
произошла самоорганизация на первых порах в 2014 году против
at first,
фашизма.
against
Восстали
fascism
лучшие люди
happened. Best people rose up
на Донбассе.
in Donbass
Один из них был
and other places.
Алексей
One of them
Мозговой,
was
такой
Alexei
призрак.
Mozgovoi. He had
Был
this,
убит
his ghost squad, Battalion Prizrak, and he was killed
в Алчевске,
in
в
Alchevsk,
парке
in the
20-летия
park of the
Победы
20th anniversary
Советского Союза.
of the victory of the Soviet
Там
Union.
установлен небольшой памятник такой, который сейчас
They have installed a small monument in his memory,
приходит в
erected,
запустение, потому что
which
современные
is
власти
slowly being worn out. This with time, because the current authorities do not repair it.
не очень любят.
They don't like this figure, Alexei Mozgovoi. Today, Alexei
Исполнилось бы
Mozgovoi
50 лет.
is his birthday. He would have turned 50
Алексею Мозговому.
today.
Ну и какие выводы?
So, what conclusions should we make, and what
Какой упор
emphasis
делать
should we
пропаганде?
place on our propaganda?
Ну,
In our
прежде
propaganda.
всего,
First of
упор
all,
на том,
the
на чем
emphasis
власти
is
современные делать его не будут. Вот они
that
хорошо
modern
занимаются,
authorities
да, отбивают
won't
какие-то
focus on.
атаки там.
They're good at
Отбивают
repelling
этот
some
Мединский тоже
attacks.
фигура, да?
Medinsky,
Мединский,
our
который всегда
Minister of Culture,
пытался
and he's a famous figure who tried
открыть
to
доску Маннергейма.
open the Mannerheim board there.
Фельдмаршал Фину, который участвовал в
Finnish
блокаде
field
Ленинграда.
marshal who participated in the attack, Nazi attack on Leningrad.
Да, вот этот Мединский
This
участвовал
Medinsky
в
took
переговорах,
part in the negotiations and in
возглавлял.
the Istanbul
Сейчас он
negotiations
исторический клуб
And now he
возглавляет и
heads
борется за
for peace with Ukraine. And now he's head of history
чтобы,
clubs,
сказать, история правильно преподавалась.
and he's responsible for the correct teaching of history in Russian schools.
Какую историю, понятно, что он искажает.
So what kind of history will he teach? They teach. Of course, it will be distorted,
Этот Мединский.
and Medinsky is
Поэтому
distorting
нужно
it.
делать упор на
So
том,
we
что власть не делает, да?
Need to
Показывать, что
show what the
защищали
government
не
doesn't
только
show,
страну, не
that
только территорию,
not
но
just the
защищали
country,
еще
not just the
социалистический,
territory was
этнический. Очень
defended,
важно
but
было.
also the socialist
Классовый
fatherland.
характер.
This is
Кроме
very
того, что она
important.
была отечественная, она
It still
была,
had
да,
a
носила еще и
class
классовый
character. In
характер.
addition to being a patriotic war, this war also had a class
Вторая
character.
мировая, она еще была и
The
классовой.
Second World War was also a class war.
То есть
From
социализм
our
боролся с
point of view,
капитализмом.
socialism fought against
Причины
capitalism.
возникновения
The reasons for
фашизма.
the emergence of fascism.
Вот Германия,
Here
например,
in Germany, for
по
example,
окончанию, да, была
at
подписана
the end, the act of capitulation was signed
подписан о том, что 8 мая
that
23:01 прекращаются боевые
8th
действия.
of May, all military actions must cease.
В Советском Союзе это
the
уже
Soviet
был другой
Union
часовой пояс, это было 9
It was a
мая,
different
поэтому
time
здесь
zone,
как
so
бы
it was May 9th.
значения определенные
Therefore,
8-го,
certain
9-го. Мы отмечаем
differences
9-го, они 8-го.
We celebrated 9th, and the West celebrates at the 8th of
Германия
May.
была
Germany was
разделена на 4
divided
зоны.
into 4
И
zones,
проводилась политика
and
4
there was the policy
децентрализация,
of the 4 things:
демилитаризация,
decentralization, demilitarization,
демократизация.
denazification, and democratization.
Должна была произойти.
All of this should have taken place.
Мирный договор
The peace treaty
писал Хрущев.
was signed by
Германии.
Khrushchev.
Ну, от капитуляции
In
она
Germany, he
разделила.
was responsible
Иосиф
about the
Виссарионович хотел
capitulation.
провести там демократические
Stalin wanted to
выборы
hold
в
democratic
Германии.
elections there in
Потому что
Germany
на
because
В тот момент
at that
Германия
time,
имела тоже
Germany
славную
also
революционную
had a
историю,
glorious
всё, да, и
revolutionary
пролетарская
history.
борьба там была, и
There was a proletarian struggle and so
в какой-то
on.
момент загнали всё.
Fascists
Но то-
simply defeated them at some point.
Но
They forced everything back.
в то время
But at
была
that time,
возможность
there was an
провести
opportunity to bring
установить
and
на
establish
территории всей
the
Германии, как ГДР, такие же порядки.
same order throughout the
Но
whole Germany,
Франция,
like in
Англия
German Democratic Republic.
противились.
But France and England
и
resisted.
Так это как бы образовалось, поэтому две Германии.
So that's why
Ну
two
и
Germanys
Хрущев в 1955
were
году только
created.
подписал.
One the DDR, German Democratic Republic, and the other Federative Republic of Germany.
Что, мирный
Well,
договор
Khrushchev only signed a peace treaty with Germany
Германии.
in
Непонятно с какой.
In 1955, he signed a peace treaty, not clear with which Germany, in which one, probably with Federative Republic of Germany, the western part. So we need to explain all this. Modern communists in Russia. How did fascism emerge, and under which circumstances the bourgeois democracy can be destroyed and fascism can be created. So, under which circumstances can we carry out denazification? Of course, we can make demilitarization, but denazification, the Soviet Union carried it out on its own territory, and France, Germany, England, and the United States carried out the Nazification within their occupation zones. What was that like? They were essentially saving these people, these Nazis, the West. When the goal of SMO is declared to be denazification, can our bourgeois regime, within what limits can it organize denazification? Probably, of course, certain certain noticeable figures will be people will be denazified, but in general, the way the Soviet Union done this on its territory, unlikely. And of course we need to explain the reason why the authorities, Russian authorities, are doing this to the very end, within their propaganda campaign about the results of the Second World War. Why? Because they themselves have a class kinship with those who fought against the Soviet Union. This also needs to be shown. Well, we know and see now that the world is changing rapidly. Trade war that Trump is unleashing, where will it lead to? The question, that's a big question, right? And it is clear that if things go according to the negative scenario, we will be witnessing the beginning of the Third World War, by and large. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should change the world in a certain direction, and to avoid all this and for the humanity to continue to exist, the world must be socialist. This is the main task that we must, in my opinion, do in our propaganda. Thank you. Questions have been... Let's answer the questions now. Let me read this. There's a group of scientists who came forward with an initiative to change the chronology of Second World War, to consider it its beginning not the September 1st of 1939, but 1938, the beginning of the aggression of militaristic Japan against China. China lost about 20-30,000 million people in the war, which is no less than the USSR. What's your opinion on this? Well, my personal opinion is that nothing needs to be changed. Those who witnessed those events accepted these points of reference. We should probably stick to them. China did indeed lose a lot of people during the war, but China at that point was different. Now we perceive China as some kind of single powerful state, and then they had the emperor, some areas were controlled to a greater extent, some to a lesser extent. So the emperor was a puppet, right? That's what I'm saying. Probably the Oriental experts in Oriental history, in Chinese history, should study that. I'm not ready to answer this question. A weird question about the falsification of history and individual episodes of the Patriotic War by modern media. Modern media. Goebbels started with this, right? Our media, Russian media, also falsify this to prove their bourgeois doctrine, which they impose on society. You can highlight some facts. Because lots of events took place in the war, but all kinds of events. But there's the main group that prevails over the rest. There are small ones. You can distort it even by keeping silent about certain facts, pushing forward to the forefront certain deviations, and you can thereby deviate from the general vector of the war or its events. Of course they do that. Real events can be distorted by putting some events out front and keeping silent about the other events. This is being done today, not only by our media. Their task is to reduce the role of the Communist Party, of Bolsheviks, of Stalin, to the point of being distorted, to the point of being unrecognizable. Same thing was done by Gorbachev, Khrushchev. And thus, this is the end of the lecture. Bye-bye.